A very good morning and welcome to yet another exciting edition of Media Monitor on SABC News Channel 404. I'm Sakina Kamwendo, and here's what you can look forward to in this morning's edition. We start off by taking a look at the Hawks raid of seasoned journalist and author of the book The President Keeper's Home, and we ask, why is this raid carried out? We'll also delve into the reshuffle of cabinet ministers and ask, what is this new dawn that the media speaks of when referring to the Ramaphosa presidency? And lastly, we'll take a look at the adoption of the EFF motion on land expropriation. Well, we're pleased to be joined this morning by Professor Ilva Rodney-Gumede from the University of Johannesburg's Department of Journalism, Film and Television. And also with us this morning, political analyst Aubrey Mashitri and digital news producer Butule Putini. Good morning and thank you to all of us for coming through. But before we delve into the discussions, let's take a look at what the Sunday papers are running with this morning. Starting with the Sunday Times, they leading with a story about the Gupta brothers' mine heist. Now, Sunday Times reveals that the strike by angry mine workers at 4 Gupta-owned mines exposed the notorious brothers and how they used their lucrative mines as massive cash cows to strip money and thereby endanger the lives of their workers. City Press, they're running with a story about President Ramaphosa, who's facing a backlash over his new cabinet and Parliament's resolution on land expropriation. He and the new finance minister, Nhlanhla have a crisis to deal with. Looking at Sunday Independent, they leading with a story about former Eskom board chairman Zola Tsotsi, who's accused of lying to the parliamentary inquiry into state capture at Eskom regarding the suspension of executives. Now, former SAA chairperson Dudu Myeni is set to blow the lid on what actually happened when she met with Zola Tsotsi on 2 occasions. KZN Sunday Tribune, they leading with a story about CM Lee and that murder case. A sex worker and former colleague who lived with the murdered CM Lee has claimed that her alleged killer was a drug kingpin in the industry and fears that the ongoing investigation is mired in a cover-up. And finally, the Weekend August, they're running with a story about a jet belonging to the Gupta family. Now, the Guptas bought the plane with the help of a $41 million loan from the Export Development Canada, which is Canada's state-owned export-import bank. The EDC now says that the family defaulted on the loan in October and still owes the bank $27 million. That's what you can look forward to in the Sunday papers this morning, but we shift gears now to focus on the digital segment and what people were talking about on the digital news platforms by looking at the major hashtags that caused a lot of buzz and conversation this week. Butule, please take us through it.
Good morning, Sakina. Thanks for having me. Well, we started the week with an interesting topic, which is the cabinet reshuffle. It is still trending today, and we all know that President Ramaphosa made this announcement Monday night. It was very interesting to see how he has brought back Minister Nhlanhla into the Ministry of Finance, and it was also interesting to see Bheki back into the cabinet. A lot of people had a lot to say. Some were unhappy though about Bathabile Dlamini heading women within the presidency. We'll take a look at some of the tweets from people on social media. Yes.
It's very interesting, and of course later on we'll also with our guests discuss this notion of a new dawn. Yes. And what is so new given the faces that we've seen. These are all faces we've seen before.
Yes, yes.
But let's take a look at some of the actual tweets.
Let's actually take a look at these tweets. Koza says, shame, Baba Mbalula, you are still my favorite. Hashtag cabinet reshuffle. And Tandile says, I hear many people analyzing why the president appointed Bathabile Dlamini into women's ministry. Well, until the president, explains itself, I accept no explanation or analysis. And then Africa says, after I had that Bheki is back, I had to reconcile with my enemies and hide my weapon.
Well, the return of Bheki there, Aubrey, surprising. What's new in that?
Well, it wasn't. Bearing in mind that in the broader context of the cabinet reshuffle, there was a need to reward those who had been loyal to President Cyril Ramaphosa during his campaign. And he was unavoidably one of the people who was going to be rewarded. And there was an expectation amongst many South Africans that he should be deployed to the crime-fighting portfolio.
Well, they certainly got their wish granted. But of course, that takes care of the cabinet reshuffle. What else was trending this week?
We have next hashtag 7 Angels. Now, this sparked a lot of talk on social media where the Ngcobo police station experienced a tragedy in the past week. And the police actually raided the ministry or the church, and they rescued young children, women, and about 7 people were killed by the police at that church. Investigations are still being done, but people are actually questioning the laws surrounding religion within South Africa.
Well, law surrounding religion, the Constitution guarantees
well, yes.
all South Africans, you know, the right to freedom of religion. And I think this falls in that category. So it's going to be one that's going to be very tricky, Professor Rodney Gumede.
Indeed, and I think that when we talk then about, for example, regulation of faith-based communities and churches, as in this case, we have to be well aware of that we have other Chapter 9 institutions as well that actually guarantees human rights or has the capacity to rule on some of these issues, like the Human Rights Commission, for example, which is also a Chapter 9 institution. But we can come back to that.
Well, these are some of the actual tweets once again.
Wilson says, on freedom of belief, where does hashtag CRL draw the line between what's right and wrong? Regulating religion is almost impossible. Hashtag 7 Angels and Ngcobo. And then Ligaso says, at newsroom, hashtag 7 Angels branches should be closed countrywide. And lastly, Pastor Sechaba says, he was quoting Banela Mangcoba, and he says, men, we're not running a cult but a church. And then he says, scripture says Satan is able to transform himself into an angel of light. Hashtag 7 Angels.
Very interesting one, this, and an attack on the police, I think we all understand, is a direct attack on the state itself.
Yes,
so it's going to be interesting to hear further discussions and deeper introspection into what actually is going on.
Yeah. Now, the last hashtag, Sakina, it's more like sad news. People reacted to the gruesome killing of a Taxify driver on Thursday night. He was allegedly shoved into his boot, and the car was set alight in Sunnyside in Pretoria. Now, people are saddened by this. Some people fear that their lives as well could be in danger because of the friction within the taxi industry. Now, Baba says, it's in the South African taxi industry where majority do not act like business people. Instead, they feel entitled. If you have competition, change your business model. Don't kill hashtag Taxify. And then Annie says, at Bekicele, I see she's trying to charge there and make Bekicele take note of this. Please protect Uber and Taxify from murderous meter taxi thugs. And then lastly, Bongingosi says, meter taxis need to accept that innovation and technology have made people's travel life easier, faster, and possibly cheaper too. And killing Uber taxi drivers ain't gonna solve anything.
Yeah, ongoing one, this one, but also very disturbing. But Bukule, thank you so much for that. And after the break, we'll talk about Jacques Pauw's home invasion by the Hawks, which happened earlier this week. So do stay tuned for that.
No. Yes. Yes.
Sports Live every Saturday and Sunday at 7:30 p.m.
Are you about that trending life? The looking good and all that stage? Well, fear not, because Trends has all the fashion do's and don'ts for you to stay on point this upcoming season.
This film will be an immersive spectacle. You got Kong that's 100 feet tall.
It tells this incredible story of man versus nature.
The iconic stage production by Mbongeni Ngema is back with a bang.
Sarafina is a classic South African production.
I always choose to align myself with brands that I just love. Because when you love something, it doesn't become work.
Luxury is not built overnight, but it's an experience that comes with time.
Catch up with all the trends on Trends Saturdays at 12.
News at 9. We go beyond the headlines of the day's breaking news to bring you all the angles and in-depth analysis of stories. We go beyond the surface, including on how it will impact your life. Join us every day at 9 to zoom in on the day's big stories.
Welcome back to Media Monitor. Now, the author of the hard-hitting expose, The President's Keepers, Jacques Pauw, is back in the news, and this follows Wednesday's raid at his home by the Hawks, who were reportedly searching for classified documents related to the controversial book. The state security agency says that Pauw violated the Intelligence Services Act by publishing people's personal tax information, amongst other violations. Well, let's get into it. Professor Rodney Gumede, let me start with you. Someone asked a very interesting question on my radio show earlier this week, asking, is it a question in the case of Jacques Pauw of once a journalist, always a journalist? Because by his own account, Jacques Pauw stated that he was a retired journalist. So can we just address that question first?
No, absolutely. And I mean, anyone can be a journalist, you know. If I write and I put information out in the public realm, I do some kind of work along the lines of a journalistic, journalistic production. However, as a journalist, and I think that we can agree with this, and we have a lot of journalists around us right now because we're in a TV studio and we're discussing the news, that there's certain professional standards that you have to abide by to call yourself a professional journalist. In this case, whether Jacques is retired or not is neither here or there. The account, his book that he's produced, is a journalistic account, and it puts information out in the public realm that wouldn't have been there otherwise.
Which takes us to the next question, Aubrey, about the possession of classified information. And as a journalist, how do you deal with that without transgressing the law? Where's that line? Where do you overstep into the realm of now being complicit in criminality?
Well, let's start with the journalism question. Peter Bruce wrote a piece at the time of the publication of the book in which he argued that if this was a journalism piece, that he as an editor had to decide whether it should be published in his newspaper, he would not have published. Because in his view, in the process of writing this book, things such as, principles such as giving people the right to reply did not happen. So it's debatable whether they should be regarded as a journalistic piece. But when it comes to the violation of our laws, my starting point is that whether you want to act within the rule of law or not, for me, is not the real question if what you are pursuing is justice or the right thing. So if I decide that I'm going to reveal state secrets and it is in the public interest and the state is misbehaving, I should not care about consequences. I'm not even going to hide behind the rule of law or anything like that. If I am convinced I'm doing the right thing, and the state wants to prosecute me or even convict me, I must be prepared to face those consequences. But we must remember, we must have a debate about whether in the first place the state should have secrets, because there are those who don't believe the state should have secrets in the first place as a philosophical position. So you start from that broad perspective, and then you come to what I'm saying now, that if I were Jacques Pauw, I would not be standing on top of mountains screaming that my rights are being violated by having my home raided, because it's a sacrifice I would be prepared to make for doing the right thing in the public interest.
Professor Rodney Gumede, I know you want to say something to that.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of things, and I think that it's we can debate where you publish things, you know. And that is a book form. It's not an excerpt, for example, or written up for a newspaper where other rules might apply in terms of editorial policies and so forth. I think that the question, as Aubrey rightfully raises around state secrets, is also very, very important here, because that goes to the heart of the matter, why the raid then happened at his home down in the Western Cape. I mean, state secrets is not something we can sit and debate and decide in advance what we're going to, you know. Classified information is tricky, and I think it has to go to court. And this is what Aubrey points out as well. Then we can debate what information we need to keep out of the public realm, or sometimes even out of court. But it has to end up there first. We can't have sort of a willy-nilly take on, you know, now we're looking for this or that because it's a state secret. That's, you know, that's neither here or there. And then we have to also separate out personal information. We've been talking about tax records here, for example, vis-a-vis then information that needs to be kept secret in the interest of protecting the nation, etc., etc.
And if there's a young journalism student watching this right now, and someone somewhere is offering them some very, secret information, how do they go about it? Where do they start? How do they handle that particular approach, first and foremost, Professor?
I mean, it's often difficult if you don't. I mean, I'd always say that then you need to approach, and I think going to an editor of a newspaper is always a good thing, to get advice on, you know, I have potentially explosive information, because I think these are things that we can't really rule upon ourselves. Even as a very seasoned journalist, sometimes we need to take decisions around ethical and professional course of conduct in communication with others.
So, Aubrey, quite apart from how do journalists deal with classified and sensitive information, there is, of course, also the question about how the journalistic fraternity handled this particular story about Jacques Pauw and the raid on his home. What was your take on that?
Remember, this happened in the context of a discourse on state capture. And a discourse that was, in my view, particularly reductionist in many respects, that it reduced the different actors, political and otherwise, into two groups, angels and devils, and there was nothing in between. And I've argued repeatedly that this was not about angels and devils. This, to me, has always been about angels with horns and devils with halos. And therefore, I thought there was a lack of appreciation for complexity during these debates, precisely because the state, under President Jacob Zuma, former President Jacob Zuma, had lost legitimacy. Because if we were discussing this when President Mandela was the head of state, I think we'd be having a different discussion about whether Jacques Pauw was right or wrong. And for me, as a matter of journalistic principles, we must ask the question whether, if I'm a journalist and you have a state that you believe is misbehaving, is not acting in the interests of the citizens, and I get information to that effect, are journalistic principles, editorial principles enough? I'm not convinced that they are. The higher principle should be your conscience.
So with regard to that same question about how this was handled by journalists, there's also the question, of course, of whether how the information came into the public realm, whether it was passed on by, as the Sunday Independent at some point intimated that Praveen Gordhan was the one who perhaps passed this information on to Jacques Pauw. Does that really matter? Is that something that we've reflected sufficiently upon, and should we have in the case that we perhaps didn't?
Now, we need to discuss sources here and protection of sources, absolutely. That's crucial. I think that what is important to remember as well is that, you know, this is a piece of then investigative journalism. And it's like Aubrey started, talking to that point, that investigative journalists often have to take decisions where they weigh up some certain ethical codes of conduct vis-a-vis them putting information out that there could be in the public interest. Eh? And I think that those ideas of the ends justify the means, if the story is deemed to be so extraordinary that the public needs to have this information at their disposal, it needs to come out in the public realm, then we can comply. We don't have to comply to all of the ethical codes of conduct. However, we need to be very well aware of, as journalists, what we're breaking and what we're doing in the public interest then. But coming back to the idea of sources, no, it doesn't matter who your sources, and sometimes we deal with sources that might or might not be implicated themselves in corrupt practices. However, we need to protect those sources as well. So who hands over the information to us is neither here nor there at this point.
The question of sources is politically significant to me, because we cannot assume that all the actors in this saga were acting in the public interest, even as they scream that they are acting in the public interest. The invocation of the public interest is not always in the public interest. And therefore, we must be open to the possibility that some of the sources were acting politically to try and alter the political environment to their advantage. In which case, as a journalist, as an author, you must weigh whether they are not just a tool and whether at some point consciously you yourself have not become a political actor.
Well, so many more questions regarding this, whether we have done enough to perhaps look into some of the transgressions that were allegedly taking place within the State Security Agency. How much money has the South African taxpayer had to pay over the years for this particular agency, and what exactly was that money used for? Because the allegations in the President's Keepers are damning. But after the break, we'll take a look at how the media covered the recent cabinet reshuffle. Well, you're watching Media Monitor on Channel 404. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa's cabinet reshuffle was met with criticism by opposition parties earlier in the week. And although highly anticipated, many questioned his decision to retain cabinet ministers such as former Social Development Minister Bathabile Dlamini, who was shifted from the Ministry of Social Development to the Ministry of Women in the presidency. And we ask, what is this new dawn that the media speaks of when referring to the Ramaphosa presidency? A new dawn? So what exactly is new, Aubrey?
Well, I mean, I've referred to the decade or so of former President Jacob Zuma's presidency as a decade of ignominy. If you know the work of Arthur Kessler, the book Darkness at Noon, we have just come out of a period we can characterize as darkness at noon. Now, I'm not sure that darkness at noon is followed by dawn. And therefore, I'm not as euphoric. I think we need to temper our sense of euphoria with a sense of realism. When we look at the cabinet reshuffle itself, there is no president who makes cabinet appointments in conditions of his own choosing. Which means one of the things we must appreciate is that what the cabinet appointments on Monday betrayed is Ramaphosa's limits when it comes to power. Because he could not make all the appointments he would have liked to make. In fact, when I saw Ace Magashule leaving that holding room ahead of him, the optics of that in terms of political communication were interesting in terms of the relationship between the party and the state. So for me, that cabinet reshuffle betrayed not Ramaphosa's power, but the limits of his power.
Professor Rodney Gumede, the media has jumped onto this bandwagon as well, the euphoria that Aubrey points to. But is that justified? Because, again, when we say this is a new dawn, apart from having a new president who is not new in the context of cabinet, in the context of ANC leadership, what else is new?
I think it's a good question. I think it's interesting that we also talk about the reshuffle. Hey? We don't talk about a new cabinet. And indeed, it is a reshuffle. Hey? And we've seen reshuffling of portfolios, for example. I think we can question, we just had a discussion around protection of state secrets, raids on journalists and so forth. Are we really seeing a new dawn here? Are we, we're getting the changes that we would like to see, really? So I think there are a lot of those questions. But yes, it is a new dawn, and we've got to hold on to that. And I think that, there's been a lot, we have to recognize there's been a lot of unhappiness in the last couple of years over the former presidency under former President Zuma. And I think that a lot of people are holding on to this idea of a new start, of something changing. And I think that the compromises that current President Ramaphosa has had to do, as Aubrey points out, he had little other choice, quite frankly. And then you could maybe debate, could he have put people into other portfolios maybe? There are some people who have gotten very crucial portfolios where maybe they haven't proven themselves under a previous regime to actually fit for office and so forth. But those are other questions.
But how much room of maneuverability is there really? Because again, many criticize President Jacob Zuma for coming out overtly and stating that the ANC comes before the nation, as it were. And now you have Cyril Ramaphosa, and one would expect then that the expectation would be for Ramaphosa to put country before party. But does he really have the room to do that?
Well, one of the things which have affected our reading of the reshuffle is the extent to which the media, or many parts of the media, have lionized Ramaphosa without any evidence in support of the need to lionize him. So that's the first problem. But cabinet reshuffles, cabinet appointments are a political act, and therefore will be informed by the contradictions and tensions that politics entails. And in this case, by the balance of forces inside the ANC, which means, therefore, there is an extent to which, when it comes to major decisions, not just a cabinet reshuffle, Ramaphosa will seek and will need the consent of his opponents. And the reshuffle demonstrated that, to me, quite clearly and quite eloquently. So there are many things to balance. And in the process of balancing this, contradictions emerge. You come to power as president on a platform of fighting corruption, rent-seeking, state capture, and so on. And there are evidence of state capture, rent-seeking, and so on in your cabinet. And that happens because you have to balance the needs of the country, the needs of citizens, with the needs of the party. Now, in my view, and I will start with an apology to politicians, when President Jacob Zuma said the party comes first, in my view, it did not tell the truth. In his case, he came first, not even the ANC. And an ANC politician or DA politician or EFF politician who says the country comes first, I don't believe them either, you know, because since 1994, there's been very little evidence that the country comes first, even on the part of some of the opposition parties, let alone the ruling party.
And before you answer that, just on the question of journalists and, you know, again, our role that we play in basically giving flesh to this new dawn theory. As Aubrey said, where is the evidence that we presented for this new dawn? Because you look at this cabinet, it's the same old faces. And even if they were not in cabinet, they were there somewhere in the upper echelons of the ANC leadership structures. So what is the evidence that journalists have put forward with regard to this being a new dawn?
I mean, on one level, I think it's played into, you know, this Ramaphosa-phoria that we've seen a little bit of. You know, people are so desperate to hold on to something new and to change that, you know, we come up with these ideas and we want to celebrate and we want to be positive about things. So I think that's part of it. However, I think you're right to raise the question of where's the evidence for a new dawn or for change, really. And I think one thing that we have not focused enough on is women. Women in the cabinet, but also we've had a little bit of focus on the gender portfolio, of course, of women in the, you know, but we haven't had enough focus, I think, on where are the women in this cabinet? What are they doing? What portfolios do they hold? How many women do we have? And what are the gender issues that this new cabinet are going to have to deal with, or the new government's going to have to deal with? And I think that's important. And we know that we didn't get a woman in the position of number 2, for example, which I think a lot of people would have liked to see. So there are all of those questions as well that don't talk necessarily to a new dawn.
You know, you're right, because in this country, things such as poverty, inequality, and unemployment have a feminine face. And they also have a black face. So you have Bathabile Dlamini, the leader of an ANC Women's League that, in my view, is patriarchy in a dress, being in that portfolio. That, to me, is an insult to women. But what it betrays also is the ANC lack of understanding at a theoretical level of what the challenges are when it comes to changing gender relations in this country. But another question you can ask is, where are the young people? According to the 2011 census, the median age in the population is 25. Among so-called black Africans is 21. That reality has serious implications for planning. And you don't see that reality embraced by this cabinet reshuffle.
So there's a lack of youth with regard to women. It's the same old story with women. If you go back to Lulu Klingwana, Susan Chabang, all the ministers that have come into that portfolio have been by and large, you know, non-existent in terms of their presence in the broader society. But do we really need that portfolio, given that they've performed as dismally as they have? And now you're taking someone who's under a massive cloud, a black cloud, and you shift them to that portfolio. What's the point?
Doesn't make sense, does it? But I think, coming back to what Aubrey said already about balancing and, keeping some layers of the ANC behind you going into 2019 and so forth. But I do think that there's an important point. We made it important about gender, but Aubrey also raises the question of youth and renewal and other people coming through the ranks of the ANC who could take on new leadership positions and actually renew politics.
And of course, who are those people? Because just taking a cursory look at the new ANC NEC, does that reflect anything new? Is there a new dawn in there? I don't know. You can make up your mind for yourself. But more Media Monitor when we return from this break.
Failure to implement the water restriction is going to make the system not workable. For the domestic use, everyone should not exceed 25 kiloliters per day.
What is the penalty and how much have you raked in thus far as a municipality?
For domestic users, if they exceed 25 kiloliters, then they're going to be charged a penalty on their monthly bill. And so far already we've collected 1.7 million.
The 200 million rand state-of-the-art school in Magaliesburg had been vandalized by drug addicts. How bad is it?
It's very bad. Into the hostel residents, it was even worse because there the doors, the wardrobes, the beds, the ceiling were broken down. Showers were ripped off and it couldn't be used by students who are actually using that particular boarding facility.
Welcome back, and it is cliched, but of course time does fly when you're having fun. And this week the House passed a motion to review a section of the Constitution to pave the way for the expropriation of land without compensation. Now the matter will go through a constitutional review committee process to review Section 25 of the Constitution. As it stands right now, Section 25 sets out just and equitable compensation to the expropriated landowner. But let's take a look at more of this in this insert.
Let us close this question once and for all. Let us unite and pay no one for benefiting from the crimes against humanity. Let us come together and agree on this noble, historic and human call to expropriate land without compensation for equal redistribution. Many want us to debate food security and economic development, but how can we do so when we do not have the land? For a lasting peace, security and justice, land must be expropriated without compensation for equal redistribution.
The ANC unequivocally supports the principle of land expropriation without compensation as moved by the EFF. Honorable Speaker, we may disagree on the modalities, but the principle we agree. There's no question about that. And we are committed to implementing the resolution of the African National Congress, which resonates very well with the motion led by the CIC of the EFF.
Black people were brutally dispossessed and forcibly removed from their land. Decades later, the wounds still run deep. There is an indisputable need to right that wrong, to make amends. My fellow countrymen, Sizwe Sakuti, expropriation without compensation cannot be part of the solution. The process to lawfully implement expropriation without compensation will only prolong the wait for the landless in this country. The government needs to address the weakness in implementing the provisions in the Constitution instead of bowing to populist rhetoric.
The narrative that the land was stolen must stop because it's false. I agree. If we want to debate on a responsible manner about land, we will have to stop that.
The danger that there are those who think that equality in our time means that we must dominate whites.
As part of the measures to accelerate land redistribution, as we all know, the 54th conference of the governing party, the African National Congress, resolved that where appropriate and justifiable land will be expropriated without compensation.
Well, one of the headlines this week read, the ANC claims moral victory after EFF's motion on land is passed. So, whose victory is it really? Professor?
Oh, it's difficult to say. I mean, I think it's interesting. This is, of course, something that's been on the EFF slate for a very, very long time. So pushing it now, of course, has put pressure on the ANC. And I think we've heard some of the debate then from Parliament where this is a controversial issue, and that is not to say that it's hugely important, and I think we would all disagree with people who would claim that this is not about stolen land or this is about redress, but it's a question about how we do it, and I think that. The Constitution is quite clear on how, or maybe not exactly clear, but we have a Constitution that actually sets out how we could deal with this. And the question is then the changes that we want to foresee. What will they in effect do, and how well thought through will these changes be to the Constitution?
So one of the things we saw is the media grappling with how to actually deal with this in terms of its reporting on the matter. What for you were some of the highlights in that reportage, and what were some of the blind spots or shortcomings in the media's reporting on this issue?
I must say, Sakina, that I'm generally underwhelmed by the debate we have had on expropriation of land without compensation. I'm even more underwhelmed by the resolution passed by Parliament and the ANC before that. If there are two things I don't believe the ANC will do, it is radical economic transformation, and secondly, the expropriation of land without compensation. For me, what has been missing in the debate, in the media, because we're talking about the media, is what the land issue is about. This is not a debate about land. It's a debate about the sense of being of the majority of South Africans. So we tend to think that when people are talking about the need for land, they are talking about pieces and chunks of land. They are talking about their sense of being, their connection to the land, and what that connection means to them. And I've heard many people talk about the fact that the land issue is emotive. My own argument is that yes, it may be emotive, but what's more important is that it is emotional. Emotional in the sense that there is a spiritual, there is an emotional, and other forms of connection between the self and the land. So that understanding of what the land means has been missing. What also has been missing is a sense of intersectionality in understanding what the land issue means, in this sense, that you have an intersection of history, an intersection of historical memory, historical amnesia, economic issues, psychological issues, spiritual issues, and so on. For me, that has been missing in the debate. And therefore, we've reduced this debate into a debate about a number of hectares of land that must go this way or that way. When it comes to Mosiuoa Lekota and Cope, I think the less said about them, the better. Because theirs is a very unsophisticated reading of the Constitution when it comes to that. The Constitution says, amend me. And I don't know what COPE does not understand about that. So it seems to me, if any assistance must be given to Musiwa Likwata and COPE, someone must give Musiwa Likwata a copy of the Constitution, because his copy does not have an amendment clause.
But he's always waving it at us. But also, do you think the media could have done more in terms of perhaps just taking us back down memory lane and down the route of history, maybe chronicling exactly how the land was taken, how people were dispossessed over time of this land? Because that was something that I thought was also partly missing.
I think you're right, and I think that is a very good suggestion. And I mean, it goes back to questions around what is it that we're debating? What are the questions here? And I think you cannot actually and separate the idea of economic redress, for example, from dignity, from people's connections back, and a restoration of and how people's identities are shaped and formed, and those are questions that the media should be looking at, and of course dissecting as well. But I think yes, we maybe need to spend a little bit more time on our history and actually explaining that to our audiences and readers as the news media, and I think that's a very good point you're making.
One of the things that also struck me was about the agenda setting. Who sets the agenda right now? In Parliament, for example, it seems as though the EFF is leading there. They pretty much set the agenda. They pretty much determine the narrative that everyone else follows. But then as far as the media goes, it seems as though whoever asks the most provocative, albeit sometimes ridiculous question gets to set the agenda, because we all then coalesce around that and trying to answer that. Is that necessarily the right way to approach this?
Well, in the media, the same people or groups of people set the agenda on this issue as they always do on other issues. It's men, it's the middle class, it's the chartering classes, and a lot of the people who are talking about when it comes to land hunger are not part of this debate. In fact, when you look at the question of land, I think the absence of those voices is quite critical, because then you have those who try to set the agenda by suggesting that we should reduce problems with land reform to failures of the state. So this argument that there is enough in the Constitution for the ANC government over the past 24 years to have done land reform effectively. And the suggestion, therefore, that you don't need expropriation without compensation. I agree that the state has been inefficient in dealing with land reform. I do not agree that this should be justification for opposition to the idea of expropriation without compensation. I believe that expropriation without compensation should be one option amongst many that we should consider.
And of course, there's much more to talk about around that. But just in closing, any stories that you think we should be on the lookout for this week?
Well, I think that the story on the Normal killings will definitely continue. Will be a big story in the news media. I think we will have a lot of debates about the question of land, definitely. And then, of course, we will keep watching the new or the reshuffled cabinet.
Aubrey?
The same. What I would end is that I would like to see more on Ingobo and what it means. Because I think, once again, we have had a misplaced debate about freedom of religion, and Ingobo is not about freedom of religion.
Well, thank you so much to everybody, all our guests this morning, and to you for watching our show, Media Monitor. And we hope that you'll join us again same time next week. And from me and the rest of the team, have a blessed day, and we'll see you again next time.